Welcome back, it's Liam from Levity Books, and I hope you're reading well. If there was ever a time to wear a good black turtleneck, now is the time. Because today we're talking about Karen Green's Bough Down, which is a fantastic piece of poetry that is as tragic as it is important. The most difficult experience we'll all face one day is the death of a loved one, and I think the best preparation for that is to see how others face and conquer their grief. This poetry review will deal with depression and grief, so if you're not in the right headspace, don't come back until you've hugged someone. So, Bough Down was an elegy published in 2013 after the death of this author's husband, David Foster Wallace, in 2008, and we kind of need to talk about it to understand this work. Most readers agree that the death of David Foster Wallace is the most tragic event of the history of literature in the 21st century. It's one of many reasons that motivates me to study the neuroscience of depression and suicide. And in my opinion, it isn't so much because David died from suicide, but rather the timing of his death. In 1993, in what I think is his most intellectually strong essay, E Unibis Pluram, he described this new literary movement, new sincerity, that would come about to take hold of the postmodern irony that was saturating most of popular culture, especially on TV and the news, and he wanted this new sincerity movement to teach us all to care for one another by talking about those deep and sensitive topics that we normally can't talk about. It was this saturation of postmodern irony that was threatening honesty and goodwill, which were essential for communities. And in 1996, in the masterpiece Infinite Jest, which is my all-time favorite book, which I'll go into in a lot more detail at another point, David showed for the first time that new sincerity could really be implemented within a narrative, a bold and compelling experimental narrative in which he showed his struggles through depression, and it seemed like he had got through depression. This is important to realize because, in a sense, Bough Down is an elegy about the death of David Foster Wallace, and it brings this style of new sincerity to poetry. There's an intention to care, sentimentality, and sharing of intimate feelings that really resonates with what I think this movement is about. Bough Down is an autobiographical prose poem that chronologically chronicles the years after the widow finding the body of David Foster Wallace to her eventual optimism for life. This widow, Karen Green, has a remarkable voice for poetry that I think just hasn't been realized yet. For instance, this poetry is never dark, which it easily could be. It is kind, loving, sad, sorry, lonely, and even painfully funny at times. I want him pissed off at politicians, ill at ease, trying to manipulate me into doing favors for him. I would do anyway. I want him looking for glasses, trying not to come, doing the dumb verb of journaling, getting spinach caught between canine and gum, berating my logorrhea or my not staying mum. I don't want him at peace. And reading these lines in Bough Down makes it clear to me that David was loved. His medications may have failed him, but his marriage surely didn't. Bough Down is sad, but it has some funny moments. There's a time where she laughs at the fact that she didn't even realize that she was scaring a date away by being so forthcoming about her experiences. And there's another time where she's flirting with strangers at the door by accident, and it's just really kind of awkward. And this sense of humor is similar to what I found funny in David Foster Wallace's writing too. But then there's some times where it's just so sad because she's struggling to sleep at night because she's awake thinking about the shade of his nipples or how their bellies used to rub together. It's just so sad. I think the title Bough Down refers to Karen Green's ability to surrender to the medication that helped her through her grief in a way that she feels that David couldn't surrender to his medication. That it is good to bow down to what supports us. But that interpretation grossly simplifies the gravity, depth, and breadth of fond reflections that make Bough Down a heartfelt and pure work of poetry. And I really wanted to make this video because Karen Green's poetry is so underrated and so unseen. On page 74 she writes, "Nobody knew you before your husband took his life. Nobody knew me, nobody knew me. I think this may be true." Karen Green's poems are an image-text hybrid, which each page contains a stanza of a thought or a memory, and the page next to it contains this image, which is either a clipping from a newspaper or from a letter or a postal stamp. And this makes Karen Green's poems read like correspondences, letters, diaries. They're very personal. They move with feeling and they move with time. In Bough Down, most of these images are clippings of text, and many of them seem related to David Foster Wallace's writings, or may even be unpublished writings. And so reading Bough Down is like reading a secret code. The mismatch between the image and the written stanza read like flashbacks triggered by subconscious associations. Bough Down is more raw and understandable than the text of most poems. However, the image associations make it quite complex. It doesn't leave it naked. There is continuous analysis that can be applied to this work. Karen Green's voice writes with the brave passion of Anne Sexton about the listlessness from longing, but there is this unique, gentle tenderness to her voice. It is clear that this author tended to her garden as she did her husband, and his loss from the world displaced her sense of responsibility and belonging. So with all that said, Bough Down is a beautiful piece of poetry by itself, but it's also, in my opinion, very culturally important because it marks the 2010s as the first decade where it was socially acceptable for people to talk about grief. For instance, Anne Carson's Knox in 2010 was critically acclaimed for the same reasons I think Bough Down should be too, because as an elegy, it got closest to grief than anything else before it. Reading Bough Down as a book also reminds me of acclaimed rock albums that came out in the 2010s, specifically Benji by Sun Kil Moon and A Crow Looked at Me by Mount Eerie, as they all chronicle the slow recovery for a grievance period. Social gatherings where people specifically meet to talk about death, called death cafes, became hugely popular in 2011, and I even know people here who run one in Montreal. And in 2016, Quebec actually had to legislate the public scattering of ashes because it was becoming too much of a nuisance to the public. So there's a really big point to all of this. The art world and the real world of Western societies have never so openly talked about grief until the last decade. And I claim that that's critically important for understanding the cultural significance of this beautiful work of poetry, because the man who died in these pages wanted us to talk about dark, deep feelings so that we could care for one another. And Karen Green demonstrates this successfully in her poetry. She fulfills his wish in this phenomenal book that you would be a fool to miss, really. As always, let me know what you think, and happy reading.